This study might have changed everything we know about fearful avoidance. Let's take a look. So I'd actually like to draw your attention to this line right here, which says our results suggest that the initial response to emotional stimuli of individuals with fearful avoidant attachment is dominated by avoidance rather than anxiety. Now, while this might not sound revolutionary at a glance, I assure you it actually is. Consider for a moment the calling card of a fearful avoidant. They are the only insecure attachment style that contains both core wounds, a fear of abandonment and a fear of losing their independence. But in those videos, you might have also heard me talk about that the way a fearful avoidant operates is actually relatively simple. Check this out. This is a visual representation of how it's generally believed that a fearful avoidant operates in relationships. It's like a kind of pendulum. On one end of the pendulum, you have their anxious side, and on the other end of the pendulum, you have their avoidant side. Now, the basic thinking goes like this. If they encounter a person in their lives that irritates one of their core wounds, the pendulum will swing towards the core wound that was irritated. So for example, let's say that they encounter an individual that triggers their anxious wound. Well, that person makes the fearful avoidant feel like they're going to be abandoned, and the fearful avoidant pendulum will swing more towards the anxious side, which means the fearful avoidant will react in a very anxious way. They're going to ask for reassurance, try to solve the problem, fall victim to limerence. Makes sense, right? Well, now let's say that the fearful avoidant encounters an individual that triggers their avoidant core wound. That person makes the fearful avoidant feel like they are losing their independence. Well, guess what happens? The pendulum will swing to the avoidance side, and the fearful avoidant will react in a very avoidant way. They'll grow distant, avoid the problem, refuse to open up emotionally. And a lot of times what you hear from individuals who are actually in relationships with fearful avoidance is that it will feel to the individual like they're dating two separate people. The pendulum is ever swinging back and forth. And I actually really like what psychoanalyst Erica Comazar had to say about this exact thing in my interview with her.
So first was discovered avoidant and ambivalent, and then later was discovered disorganized. And when they discovered disorganized and they tied it to borderline personality disorders, bingo, it made a lot of sense.
And this tracks, right? You have this pendulum swinging like crazy, people feeling like they're dating two personalities. The anxious core wound gets triggered, they swing anxiously. The avoidant core wound gets triggered, they swing avoidantly. Here's the problem. According to this research, that's really not how fearful avoidants operate at all. Now, this study was designed to examine the response of individuals with fearful avoidant attachment orientation to neutral, emotionally positive, or emotionally negative visual stimuli. And what the study ultimately found was that fearful avoidants are significantly different than that of individuals with anxious preoccupied attachment, but is similar to that of individuals with dismissive avoidant attachment. So let's bring our pendulum graphic up again and chart out what this study actually found. It argues that if any one of the two core wounds gets triggered, the fear of losing independence, the fear of being abandoned, the fearful avoidance preference won't be to swing to the offending side of the spectrum, but to rather swing always towards an avoidant approach to dealing with the situation first. Why? Why is the fearful avoidant always prone to swinging avoidantly first? Well, I'd actually like to point you back to that interview I did with Erica Comazar. On top of being a psychoanalyst, she actually also studies how attachments are formed in early childhood. Here was her take.
To a lot of stress very early by separating this incredibly vulnerable, fragile little person from their go-to person in the world who makes them feel safe. So safety and security isn't internalized till about the age of 3. At about the age of 3, 85% of our right brain is developed. That is the part of our brain that makes us feel safe no matter what is going on in our life. It helps us to manage stress. That helps us to manage our emotions. So emotional regulation isn't internalized till after the age of 3, and only if a mother or primary attachment figure regulates that baby's emotions from moment to moment in that first 3 years.
She then goes on to make an interesting analogy that I think might be the key to answering this question.
Babies are born. It's like being on a sailboat in the Atlantic. They're born without the ability to regulate their emotions. What mothers do is they bring babies back to the Caribbean.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to steal that. Right. I love that.
Right. Okay. So it's not this, because that would be strange and depressed. Right. It's like this, right? And so that's what we're trying.
It's not as choppy, no, it's not the crazy peaks and valleys.
Right.
So to use Erica's analogy, someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style has likely never experienced the Caribbean, the calm waters. They're used to these insanely choppy waters throughout their entire lives. And from a young age, since they were really never able to have caregivers that could bring them to the Caribbean, they have come up with all of these coping strategies to get there. And likely the strategy that they rely on the most is actually relying on themselves the most, which is a very avoidant trait. Independence. I need to solve this problem myself. Let's walk a mile in a fearful avoidant shoes for a moment. You are traveling these treacherous, choppy waters, and the only way you've learned to navigate them is by learning not to rely on others, to self-soothe. And you practice the behavior over and over again. There's just one problem with this analogy. I've just explained exactly how a dismissive avoidant navigates the choppy water. So what separates the fearful avoidant from the dismissive avoidant? Well, let's go back to our pendulum graphic again and use me as a guinea pig. Now let's say I'm a fearful avoidant and someone triggers my core wounds. Now, just like our research found, I swing to my avoidance side to cope with the stress. Fearful avoidants are often defined by their movement from one end of this pendulum to the next. So what is it that can pull me to my anxious side? Well, to properly explain this, we actually need to jump back to the choppy waters graphic. Now, the argument I made before was that in order to navigate the choppy waters, a fearful avoidant will first learn to be independent. But what if in the process of doing that, it actually triggers their caregivers to regulate them? Well, that's nice, right? That's what all children are searching for. There's just one problem. That regulation from the caregiver is inconsistent. So the next time that the fearful avoidant encounters choppy waters, they do what they did last time. They go independent with the secret hope that this will draw their caregiver to them so that their caregiver can give them the support they need. But the caregiver doesn't come. This, of course, causes the fearful avoidant to panic, and instead of staying independent, they go berserk, attempting to get reassurance, which, of course, causes their caregiver to grow annoyed and rebuke them. And what unfolds is a vicious cycle. The fearful avoidant will encounter choppy waters, they cope by going independent, they get an inconsistent response from their caregiver, and then they cope by either going independent or seeking reassurance to self-soothe. And then the cycle repeats again and again and again. Now let's come back to me on the pendulum. When we last left me, I was digging in my heels by using an avoidant coping strategy. But this is a learned behavior that I have embedded in me from childhood. Secretly, what I'm hoping is that the distance will actually cause you to chase me. Yet let's say that you don't chase me. Enough is enough. You are tired of my crazy mood swings. Well, this is ultimately what causes my anxious side to trigger. It's literally more of the same cycle. I encounter choppy waters, I cope by going independent, I get no response from you or an inconsistent response, my anxious side gets triggered, and it never ends. And here's where I'd like to challenge the status quo. I've noticed a bit of an issue in our comments section lately. There's a bit of a war being waged, and there are two sides to this war. On one side of this battle are how can I put this delicately? The people who dislike avoidance. We tend to see a lot of comments like this. But why do they have no empathy? I think this is a lot of jargon and they are just completely selfish and self-absorbed. The way they can be so cold and cruel is brushed over in these excuses that's given to them. You have to be a bit sociopathic to carry on how these so-called avoidants behave. Now there's a lot to unpack in this comment here. But first, before we do, let's take a look at the other side of this war. This is comprised of the people who are the avoidant loyalists, where we see a lot of comments like this. There's a lot of salt in these comments. Essentially, these are people who think that others are disliking avoidance way too much and ultimately are being a little bit too harsh. And like all things on the internet, when you get two camps of people together with opposing ideals, arguments are bound to crop up. Now let's go back to that comment that dislikes avoidance. There are some really interesting assertions made here, like this part, for example. Why do avoidants have no empathy? Well, based on everything that I've researched about dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance, this comment or this concept of them having no empathy is a complete mischaracterization and is simply not true. It's kind of like an oversimplification of the root problem. I think what this commenter meant to say is that individuals with an avoidant coping mechanism, well, they'll typically avoid empathy because it makes them uncomfortable. It makes them feel vulnerable. And it's really their own fears and insecurities that prevent them from getting close in relationships. But they do want closeness. Take a look at this. This is my fearful avoidant death wheel. I want you to take notice of that first stage. Now, it starts off with an avoidant who wants to be close to someone, but as they inevitably work through the stages of the death wheel, as the relationship unfolds, they're constantly undergoing this internal struggle with fluctuating between wanting closeness and fearing intimacy, which ultimately complicates how they express empathy and support others. I think the root of this problem is that the person who left that comment was probably impacted in a very negative way by someone with an avoidant attachment style. This has likely caused the commenter to throw the baby out with the bathwater. All avoidants are bad. But it's this mentality, in my opinion, that is quite dangerous, and it's not going to solve the problem. Rather, it will continue the problem. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm some sort of fearful avoidant stan. I'm not. I just don't think that solving the problem that's being presented by them is best served by demonizing them or getting into arguments with other people over them. Especially not when you consider the fact that fearful avoidance is on the rise. Check this out. In my interview with Erica, I asked her the following question. Create these coping strategies, which almost takes on an insecure attachment. So if this is true, do you have any idea, like statistically, walking around in the United States, how many people have secure coping mechanisms or insecure coping mechanisms? Do you have any like major stats on that?
So, we don't, but what I can say is you can base it on the number of people that are taking medication for depression, anxiety, ADHD, and all kinds of behavioral issues. So, and you could base it somewhat on that.
All right, so the only way to look and see if fearful avoidance is on the rise is to look and see if the numbers around depression or anxiety are going up. Well, things aren't looking so great. Like in this case where ABC News reported depression rates are at an all-time high. Or in this case where a report from CNN Health says that 1 in 6 adults have depression. But I'd actually like to point to our own internal polling for this, because they've yielded some really interesting trends. This is a timeline of 3 specific polls that were conducted with our audience. In each case, the poll question was the same. What attachment style do you believe your partner is? Now, the first one was conducted back in 2020 in our old private Facebook group. I want you to pay special attention to the fearful avoidant number. As you can see, 15% participants believe that their ex was fearful avoidant. I then conducted the exact same poll in 2021, and although I know it's a little confusing since some of the members added the same question twice, when you add the numbers up, that fearful avoidant percentage has risen up to 20%. Then, in 2023, a poll was conducted inside our new community, and this is where things get really crazy. That percentage jumps up to 42%. So here's what we know. Number one, we know that insecure coping mechanisms like fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance is on the rise because the anxiety and depression rates of the United States or the world at large is going up, up, up. Number two, we also know that our own internal polling research has shown a steady increase in fearful avoidance. But I also ended up stumbling upon some really interesting statements made about attachment theory and genetics. Check this out. Despite its relationship with early experiences, it is a malleable tendency that is shaped throughout development. Genetic research indicates that up to 45% of the variability in anxious and 39% in avoidant adult attachment style could be explained by genetic causes. This means that while genetics do play a role in some attachment theory, it's still mostly based on environment or circumstance. So if the caregiver is anxious or avoidant, they are likely to teach their child anxious or avoidant coping mechanisms as well. And that cycle repeats over and over again throughout time and history, which might explain why the numbers keep getting worse and worse and worse. I'm interested in finding a positive way to contribute to helping solve this problem. Now, I know me sitting up here on my soapbox and saying I want to solve the problem is likely to lead to more negative comments or more internal infighting within the comments, but I'm telling you that the core problem with fearful avoidance is not going to get better by demonizing these individuals. It's going to get better by understanding them and then getting them the help they need. And yes, for those of you who are watching this that have a fearful avoidant attachment style, you do need help. Now, I've covered this in multiple videos before, but you cannot heal your attachment style on your own. You need other attachment styles to help you along the way. It's like Erica says, showing this is how you're safe. So the therapist basically takes that over. Or a
relationship broke it, and only a relationship can fix it.
But once again, how? How does someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style fix their problems? Well, again, and I know I'm relying a lot on this interview with Erica that I did, but the interview was that brilliant, I think she already gave us the answer.
So there is no medication for someone who has a borderline personality disorder. Therapy, both narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, are treated with therapy.
So therapy. But it's really what she said about therapy that I found interesting.
And psychoanalysts don't like to use this term, but I'm going to use it because it's true. Therapy is an emotionally reparative experience.
Okay. They don't like that?
No, because it's not even what your therapist says. It's the relationship. It's not like there's some magic wisdom that comes. Sometimes there is. Sometimes there's magic that comes out of your therapist's mouth and you go, wow, that's quite an interpretation. That's so right. Sometimes that happens. It does. But most of the time, it is the emotional attunement of that relationship. It is the consistency of that relationship. It is the long time trust and a kind of empathy that you have never had in your life that is the healing of that experience. Not the magic, not the medicine, but the relationship itself.
Here's why I think it works. Remember the choppy water and Caribbean analogy? Well, what a therapist is ultimately doing is playing the role of a caregiver and essentially making those choppy waters calm. And they often do it not by dishing out magic bullet advice, which I think is what most people think therapy is about. They do it by allowing the fearful avoidant emotionally to refuel by being the one thing that the fearful avoidant likely grew up without, a consistent caregiver. But I'm going to take things a step further than Erica. She's right. Someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style needs therapy. They need help. However, I think there's a really strong argument to be made that they also need to be smart about the people that they surround themselves with. They need to be surrounding themselves with secure individuals. Yet, in my experience, people with fearful avoidant attachment styles do not surround themselves with secure individuals. They surround themselves with insecure individuals. And there's a lot of research out there on this. Like this Psychology Today article, which asserts anxious and avoidant partners may also seek their partner's traits due to wanting those traits in themselves. And because of this, all the insecurely attached people that the fearful avoidant has surrounded themselves with actually contribute to making those waters choppy. So once again, Erica's right in saying fearful avoidants need therapy. However, I don't think the therapy will be as effective if the fearful avoidant is just surrounding themselves with people who are constantly undoing all of the therapist's work. Think of it like this. The fearful avoidant goes to therapy and they feel great afterwards. The connection with the therapist has turned those choppy waters into calm ones. Of course, it's a whole week or two before another therapy session is in the book, so the fearful avoidant goes back to their normal life, surrounded by all these anxious or avoidant individuals who just make those calm waters choppy once more. What unfolds is this endless cycle where they get the therapy, the emotional stability they are craving, and then they go back to their daily life and the people or relationships they've surrounded themselves with undo all the work. I don't think this helps a fearful avoidant. If anything, it keeps them stagnant and stuck. So what needs to happen? Well, therapy is a must, but they also need to methodically remove the relationships in their life that they know are contributing to these choppy waters. They then need to replace those relationships with secure ones that can contribute to calm waters. Only then can the fearful avoidant be sailing down the Caribbean.